We're cooking. Okay, so let me give you the background on this first. All right, so there's a video game that I play. And the game's called World of Warcraft. Have you guys heard of the game before? World of Warcraft. You've never heard of World of Warcraft? It's been around for like 14 years, 15 years. So it's this game. All right. You've never seen this logo before? Yeah, I mean, it's like famous. It's a famous game. All right, so in any case, so it's a game I play. And I played it for 12 years or something like that. I played it for a while. Now, something that happens in this game, so we kind of need a management tool. Now, there's all sorts of things we can do related to this game, but I'm thinking about a kind of a utility that would help me. All right, so what we have in the game is, the normal game is you play your character, you level him up, and all of a sudden he eventually gets to maximum level. Now, really at maximum level is when the game kind of starts, because when you're at maximum level, you start doing dungeons and stuff like that. So you group up with other real people to do Dungeon A, Dungeon B, Dungeon C, things like that. Okay. Now, at the top level, once you're good and you have good gear and stuff like that, you start doing these dungeons called mythics. Okay. So if I kind of show you here, well, here, maybe the easiest thing will be this. Okay, this is what we want right here. All right, so this is the current expansion that we're working with, is this thing called Legion. So it's World of Warcraft Legion. It's the 7th expansion, the 7th version of this game. All right, so in there we have a whole bunch of dungeons. We have a dungeon called Halls of Valor. It's a 5-man dungeon. Another one called Netherian's Lair, Eye of Ashara, Darkheart Thicket. So all these guys are 5-man dungeons. Okay? Now, notice that there's a couple of versions of each of these. Halls of Valor exists as a normal heroic dungeon. Well, it actually exists in 3 different forms. A normal form, a heroic form, and a mythic form. So each of those is harder than the last. It's the exact same content, the exact same dungeon, but the harder the level you're doing it, the more difficult it is to complete, and the harder the monsters will be and stuff like that. All right. Now, the issue here is that you can only complete these dungeons once per week. Okay? So, from my perspective, the ones I care the most about are the mythic ones, the hardest versions of these. Because there might be things that I want, gear, items that drop from monsters in these dungeons that I might need from Dungeon ABC. I might need from Halls of Valor. Okay? I can only do Halls of Valor 1 time per week. Now, what ends up becoming a problem sometimes is keeping track of what you've done and what you haven't done. And it goes even deeper than this. It's not that you can do Halls of Valor once a week. It's that you can loot each boss, so each monster, each big monster in Halls of Valor. You can loot each of the bosses in Halls of Valor 1 time per week. Now, within Halls of Valor, there's usually 3 or 4 bosses in each instance. Let's see if they list them in here. It doesn't look like they list them there, but there's another site. Oh, here we go. So, so we have, I mean, there's a site that shows us all the monsters, but there's 4 bosses in Halls of Valor. I can go in Let's say I get with a group and I kill the first 2 bosses, and then I have to leave. So I drop out of the group. I can't loot those first 2 bosses again this week, but I can loot the other 2. All right, so I'm allowed to loot each boss in each dungeon 1 time per week. Does that make sense? So it's beneficial to me to see at a glance what dungeons I've done and what dungeons I haven't done, so that when I get onto the game and I'm, let's say I have an hour to do something. I want to do something for an hour in the game. I can look at what I have left this week and see, okay, what's about an hour's worth of time, without having to go and backtrack and figure out, okay, well, did I do this dungeon? Which bosses did I kill in that dungeon? Things like that. So this is information that's just public information, but it's a management tool for me that lets me know what I've already completed, what I haven't already completed, and then it'll automatically reset each week. That makes sense? All right. So let me and this will make sense once we get a little bit farther into it. Let me dungeon bosses. Okay, so let's raids. Okay, so here are the normal dungeons, because we also have these things called raids. So here's the normal dungeon. So let's go to like a dungeon like Blackrook Hold. Okay, so here's Blackrook Hold. They tell us that what's in this dungeon, and then somewhere down here, here's our 4 bosses. So we have a boss called the Amalgam of Souls, Ilisana, Ravencrest, Smash Spite, and Lord Curl blah blah blah. This guy. So these are the 4 bad guys that are in that dungeon. I can loot each of those once per week per difficulty. All right, so now what I mean by difficulty is this dungeon exists as a normal, as a heroic, and as a mythic. All right, there's 3 different levels of this dungeon for this specific one. Well, so here's the deal here. So here's all of our dungeons. Blackrook Hold is normal, heroic, mythic. Court of Stars is only mythic. Darkheart Thicket, normal, heroic, mythic. Eye of Ashara, normal, heroic, mythic. Halls of Valor, normal, heroic, mythic. Maw of Souls, normal, heroic, mythic. Netherian's Lair, normal, heroic, mythic. The Archway, only mythic. Vault of the Wardens, normal, heroic, and mythic. Okay? So for each of these dungeons minus those couple that only exist for mythic, we really need to have them in the system 3 times. Because each of them, let's just say each of them has 4 bosses. There's a couple of them that only have 3 bosses. But let's just say it's 4 bosses. So Blackrook Hold had 4 bosses in it. That means with respect to Blackrook Hold, I can kill a total of 12 bosses a week. I can kill all 4 bosses on normal. I can kill all 4 bosses on heroic. I can kill all 4 bosses on mythic. So when I complete the dungeon on mythic, I should be able to go in and check off the 4 bosses that I've tried, that I just killed, and that will let me know that that guy's already done. Yet the other ones are still available. Does that make sense? Okay, so that dungeon really exists 3 times, even though it's 3 different difficulty levels. It's the same name with 3 different difficulty levels. Okay? Now, beyond that, the same rules apply to the raids. Trial of Valor and the Emerald Nightmare. These guys have a bunch of bosses in them as well that follow the same rules. But we're just going to focus on dungeons. We're going to focus on dungeons for our initial pass at this. Okay? So now, when we start thinking about organizing this thing, so we're going to have a list of dungeons and raids. for this. So we're going to have a list of all of the dungeons. And remember, each dungeon has multiple difficulties. Okay, so we should be able to filter on some of these different things. I should be able to maybe click on normal, heroic, mythic, and it should show me the list of dungeons for those. So if I clicked on mythic, I would see 2 additional dungeons pop up that aren't on the other ones, because the Archway and what was the name of the other one, whatever it was, those 2 are mythic only. Does that make sense? So if I have 3 tabs that allow me to toggle between my dungeons, my dungeon difficulties, that's going to be, you know, kind of the way I would handle that. Okay, and that's for dungeons. Then we might have another thing for raids, but let's just start with just dungeons. Okay, so I'm going to have a list of dungeons. So dungeons are heroic or mythic, and each one has an individual lockout. I mentioned there's also a normal. Okay, raids also have, there's actually 4 different difficulty levels for raids. There's looking for raid, there's normal, there's heroic, and there's mythic. So easiest, next easiest, hardest. All right. And then as an additional feature we might eventually put on, we might have a gear wish list. So something I might do is I might say, oh, well, I need this item. This item is an upgrade to my gear. And he drops from this boss in this dungeon. So I might put that on like my favorites list. So each week I can go in and that kind of brings it to my attention that that's something I should do first early in the week. But initially we're just going to worry about lists of dungeons. Okay, that makes sense? All right. Let's see. This is kind of a design for this thing. All right, so let's just dive in here. So we're going to go ahead and let's start by creating our project for iPhone. All right, so I'm going to pop open Xcode. So Xcode is the tool that is similar to Android Studio. Okay, so Xcode is what we're going to use for creating an iPhone application. So we're going to create a new Xcode project.
Is it free?
Yeah, but it's Mac only. It's free, but it's for the Mac. You guys are going to be doing your homework. You're going to be doing the same project, but for Android. Okay? Yep. Now, I'm going to select a single view application. I almost always start with this. Like in Android Studio, I say use empty activity. That's kind of what this is. Okay? So I'll choose single view application. I'll go ahead and hit next. All right, let's call this guy wow lockout. Okay, so this gives me like a unique identifier for the application. The language we're going to use is Swift, and the device is going to be for iPhone. Okay? And these guys, core data is like a built-in database. We're going to be using a database in the cloud. So we're not going to use any of these things. So I'll go ahead and hit next. It's going to ask me where I want to save this. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to put it in my Dropbox so I don't lose it. Let's see here. Let's put it in CW. We'll just put it just directly in here. That's fine. Okay. So this is the starting point for my project. So it looks fairly similar to what you might have for Android Studio. Your files live over here. All right, so this view controller thing here is kind of like our main activity Java file. All right, view did load is kind of like on create. Similar stuff. Okay, so now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to click on this thing called main storyboard. So this is where we design our interfaces for iOS, similar to when we click on our layouts in Android. All right, and what I'm actually going to do is we're going to dump a lot of the stuff that already came with this. You'll see what I'm talking about here in a minute. So I'm kind of envisioning that we're going to have well, let's keep it relatively simple. Yeah, because you guys, I want to only do things that you guys know how to do in Android. That way you're not having to learn a ton of new stuff. Okay, so we're going to do this. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drag this guy out here. No, I'm not. I'm going to do this. I'm going to go ahead and rename this guy main activity. Okay, let's keep it linked to our mental idea of where things are in Android. Okay, so this guy's going to be called main activity. I need to rename this file main activity. And then out here in the storyboard, I need to tell this guy that he's actually a main activity. All right, so now we've kind of created the project as if it had just been built in Android Studio. Okay, so if I zoom in here a little bit, let's throw something out here on the screen. We'll put a little label out here, say dungeons or something like that. And I'll go ahead and up here is where we choose our what simulator we want to run it on. So like in Android Studio, we've been launching our application like on Nexus 5 or something like that. Typically what I do is I design for iPhone 7 Plus and I test on the iPhone SE. So I design for the largest screen size, but I test on the smallest screen size that people actually have. Because this gets back to what we were talking about early on with the Android stuff, that we have all these different size phones, right? Well, just like you have with Android, the interface builder, where we have gravity and stuff like that, so that your interface should look reasonable on different devices. This guy has something called auto layout. And then we can manipulate auto layout by putting additional constraints on things to make things look right on different size devices. And I'm sure we'll bump into that, so I'll kind of explain it as we do. It automatically takes a guess. It automatically takes a guess at what it thinks you mean. Okay, so what it ends up coming down to is, I would say 80% of the time, Apple makes a pretty good guess at what you want. 10% of the time, you have to do some massaging. The other 10% of the time, you have to do some hoping. Okay? Sometimes things don't, it gets a little bit more complex. All right, but so I put this guy in here. Here, I'm gonna drag this over here to I'll stretch it out, and we'll go ahead and we'll center that text. All right, so it should just say Dungeons on the screen, and I'm designing it here for the iPhone 7 Plus, the biggest iPhone. Okay, but now up here, when I choose the emulator that I want to run it on, I'm going to choose the iPhone SE. The iPhone SE is the iPhone 5 size device that has the iPhone 6S guts in it. Okay. Yeah, so for the people who wanted the smaller iPhone but wanted the faster iPhone, they came out with the SE. So the SE is the smallest device that people still use. The 7 Plus is the largest device that people still use. Make sense? So really, we're designing for 3 different screen sizes. The SE, the 6, and the 6S, and the 7. And then the 6 Plus, 6S Plus, and the 7 Plus. Okay? Those 3 different screen sizes. So I chose iPhone SE here. I'll go ahead and hit play. And it's going to go ahead and build my project, and it's going to launch the simulator. All right, so right now it's zoomed out quite a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to scale this guy to, let's say, 50%. Let me do something here real quick. So we noticed that that thing really wasn't centered. It's because when I first dropped that label on there, it was in the different screen size. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this guy. I'm going to say reset to suggested constraints. I'll go ahead and run it. Now he should look centered on there. At least in theory, he should look centered on there. Yeah. Okay, so now we shouldn't have those problems because, like I said, I design for the biggest screen and I test on the smallest screen. Okay? All right, so now on our main screen here, we probably are going to have we're going to have some tabs at the top, right? So we might have a tab for, it could be a button or whatever, for one that's for normal, one that's for heroic, and one that's for mythics, right? And depending on which of those I click, it should show me the list of normals, the list of mythics, the list of heroics. That make sense?
Would it be the same screen where the list?
I'm thinking the list will just change. Yep, so we'll have a second screen that'll be that list, and we'll just tell that screen that, oh, you should show the list of heroics right now, or you should show the list of normals, or you should show the list of mythics. All right, so you'll kind of see how we're going to go about this. So I'm going to get rid of that. And I'm going to throw a navigation bar here at the top. It'll look nice and pretty. We'll call this guy Dungeons. And then maybe underneath this navigation bar, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put this segmented control thing in here, which is effectively, it's effectively buttons. Okay? In fact, actually, why don't let's keep it equal to what you guys are going to be working with. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put a button out here. All right. And we're going to call this guy normal. I'm going to put another button out here. Call this guy heroic. And I'll put another button out here. And we'll call that guy mythic. Okay? So 3 different buttons. Now, when I click on one of these buttons, I want something to happen. Okay? So we kind of need to now figure out, we need to learn the Android, the iOS equivalent of Android's MVC. How do I give myself programmatic access to something? And how do I respond to events from button clicks? Okay? So I have 3 different buttons that when I click those, I'd like something to happen. And just for the time being, I'm going to throw a label out here. And let's say that we want that label to change. When I click on one button, the label should say normal. When I click on another one, it should say heroic. So depending on which button I click on, that label should change. Which means that I need to have programmatic access to that label. Just like I would in Android, right? Now in Android, what would we do? We would give that button an ID that we would recognize. So that we can go into our main activity, go into the code that's behind this guy, and say, find view by ID, r.id.mylabel, right? Okay, that's not how it works in iOS. The same thing will be accomplished, but we're not going to give a unique name to this. So watch how this works. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the class here. So this says this guy's related to main activity. Now I'm going to click on these couple little circles here. What it's going to do, it's going to show my design. Ooh, hold on a second. Let's do that one more time. So it's going to show my code here, and I can hide a couple things to make this spread out a little bit more. Okay, so it shows my code, and it shows my interface right next to each other. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that label. I'm going to hold down the control key. I'm going to drag over here. Let go, and I'm going to insert an outlet. Okay? So an outlet is a way for us to programmatically access a widget. An action is an event handler. We'll create actions here in a second. All right? So I'm going to name this guy my label. All right? So it's going to be a UI label is the type of object that is. In the equivalent of this in Android is called a text view. Right? Okay, so in Android, we've been using edit texts and we've been using text views. Text views are labels. Same thing. Make sense? So this guy is a UI label. So one thing we'll see in Swift on the iOS side is anything you see on the screen usually has a UI in front of it. If you see it, it'll have UI before it because user interface, it's something we visually will see. So we can make a pretty good guess. Oh, you want a label? It's a UI label. You want a button? What do you think buttons are called? Well, if it's a label, it's a UI label. What do you think a button is? UI button. Okay. What do you think a view is? UI view. What do you think? Okay. See the pattern here? Okay, so we can make a pretty good guess. So I'll call that guy my label. And I'll just hit connect. Boop, boop, boop. Oh, that's funny. I broke some stuff by having that, changing the name of that file. It's fine. Let me just reopen that here. Let it reload itself, and I think we should be okay. Worst case is we'll just dump that screen and create a new thing. I think it's going to work now. All right, so we'll take this guy, control drag in here. We'll call this guy my label, hit connect, and I went ahead and put that code in there. All right, so this is what it just wrote. So this is an outlet, IB outlet, interface builder outlet. So this is how MVC is implemented in iOS. So here's a variable named myLabel. It's of type UI label. He's a variable, var. Don't worry about this. Don't worry about the weak word. It's just a thing. You need it. All right?
Public, private, or something?
No, that doesn't exist in this model. This guy, though, describes this as a variable that is linked to something out here. All right? Now, nothing keeps me from typing this code myself. I can call this myLabel2, let's say. So I can paste that code in. In fact, usually I'll do that because it's a little bit, even though you thought it looked neat to be able to drag from your interface into your code, it's a little bit cumbersome. It takes a little bit of time. It's quicker just to copy the stupid thing. All right, so now what I have already hooked up is I have myLabel hooked up to this widget. Let me show you. I went in and in the code, I created a second IB outlet, right, called myLabel2. So now when I click on this guy, and I go all the way to the far right here, this shows his outlets. He has another outlet here called myLabel2. If I want to hook that up, I just drag it to the label. Now it's hooked up. Make sense? If I want to unhook him, now it's unhooked. I still have IB outlets, but they're not actually linked to any real widget. They're capable of being linked to a widget. All right, so I'll go ahead and rehook up my label. Drag this guy here. So you can kind of do it from either side. At the end of the day, what are we doing? We are connecting the interface to the code. And the way Apple does it is it actually has you connected. Drag from here to here, now they're connected. Make sense? But it's ultimately accomplishing the same crap. So I'll dump that because we're not going to need that right now. All right, so now what we're going to need in here is we're going to need a couple of IB actions, okay, to handle our events. Now, in Android, we would come in here, and if we wanted to create some on-click events for our buttons, we would do something like public void, you know, the heroic button pressed, and that guy would take in a view V, right? That's kind of the syntax for creating that guy. Okay, now I can do this here. Let me actually, I'll show it to you. I'll show you what you can do, and then I'll show you how I usually do it. Because what I'm telling you is I will almost always, now that I have one outlet made, I will rarely ever do that whole connect the dot thing again. I'll almost always copy this, paste it, and just change the type. And then go over to the interface and connect it up there. I'll rarely do that side-by-side view where you have the interface and the code. It just takes too much time. Especially as your interfaces start getting really large, it'll take even more time. All right, so, but I'll show it to you anyways, just so you can kind of see it. So I'll go back to my storyboard. So one interesting thing with Android versus, or iOS versus Android is Android has an individual layout file for each of its interfaces. iOS uses a storyboard that houses all of your layouts visually. So you can actually have things connect directly to each other, which kind of becomes handy. So let me just demonstrate that for you real quick, just so you can see like how kind of awesome it is. I'll drag that guy out there. I'll put a button here that says page 2. I'll click on this heroic button, control click there, show. That button will now make a second screen show up. Click on heroic, there's page 2. I didn't have to write an intent. I didn't have to cause an activity to launch another activity. So it automated some of that stuff for me, but I also lost the opportunity to put extras into the intent and stuff like that. So there's some other ways you can accomplish that, but I mean, don't worry about that too much right now, but I was just kind of showing that to you real quick. All right, so I'll get rid of that scene. So that guy currently goes nowhere. But now what I can do is I can click on this view controller. So view controllers are like activities. They're synonyms. So view controller is to iOS as an activity is to Android. I'll go ahead and click on my show code thing. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this mythic button, let's say. I'm going to do hold control and I'm going to drag in here. And it says insert outlet or action. And I'm going to choose an action that I want to put in there. I'm going to name this guy Mythic Button Pressed. And then I'll hit connect. And let me close this. I'll switch over to the code here. It just put in this guy for me, right like that. Now for me, I would usually write it like this. I didn't take any parameters in here because in iOS it's optional. In Android, you always have to take in a view. Who called me? Sender here is the who called me for this guy. All right. So I just wrote the IB action here for our heroic button. I'll write the IB action for our normal button. Oop. And what do we want to do with each of these? We want to set the label's text equal to something different, right? So I'll go ahead and I'm going to say self.mylabel.text is equal to mythic. So in Swift, self is like this. It's equivalent to saying this dot mylabel. Okay? Self.mylabel.text is equal to heroic. Self.mylabel.text is equal to normal. Now, one thing that's interesting with Swift, notice that semicolons are not needed. They're not necessary at the end of these lines. You are allowed to put them there, but Swift got rid of semicolons. They're optional. Yep. Now, on the surface, you might say, oh, well, that's good. Okay. But, and that's kind of why I wanted you to see Swift. Because now we've done enough projects now in Android where you guys kind of feel like you have a fighting chance, right? You have an understanding of how Android works. You feel like you kind of got it, but you haven't seen Swift before. And so I want to show you some of the differences. And at first you might look at that and say, oh, well, no semicolons, that's good. You know, a lot of languages exist and most of them require semicolons. So if you're a programmer, so you take somebody like me, where during a week, I program in many different languages. Sometimes I get stuck in a language where I'll be putting semicolons at the end of every line. Or if I've been writing Swift all day and I go and do Java, I'll be forgetting semicolons for 10 minutes or so until I get back into the, you know, and there's probably similar with when you guys are speaking your native language with friends, and then you go back to speak to somebody, people in English. You got to get out of the mode, right? Got to get back into the English speaking mode. Even though they're very similar how you're thinking, you have some nuances, right? Same thing's true here. The languages are the same. I would probably say Swift should have left the semicolons in. So fine, it's nice not to have to type them, but what it also does is it makes some structure important, where when you write code a certain way with indentation and stuff, sometimes Swift can't figure out where the end of the line is because you didn't give it the specific line ending thing. So it's almost like one of those bells and whistles that seems better than it actually is, but whatever. All right. So we have 3 different IB actions that we created here, just like we would have created 3 different things for on-clicks in Android. But notice that only this first one did we actually hook up. Yeah. These 2 we've written, but we have not connected. That makes sense? And this guy's written a little bit differently because we let Xcode write it for me, but notice I don't use the value of sender in here. So I don't need to know who called this. That makes sense? Okay. But sender is a button. He is a UI button. So I could get the title of that button. So I could do something like this. I could say let button equal sender as UI button. And then instead of saying mythic, I could say button.title for state, and I'll do normal. All right, so what this is doing is it's saying rather than me setting the text to something specific, I'm going to set the text of this label to whatever the title is for that button for its normal state. Because buttons have a normal state, they have a press state, and they have a release state. Because buttons move, right? All right, so in this case, I'm actually using the value of sender to give me access to the button that called this guy. Does that make sense? So that's kind of a reason why you might want to use those views in Android, because these guys become aware of who called them. Okay? So let me run this real quick and I'll show you. So we're going to set the label. So this is for Mythic. Now remember, the other 2 buttons are not hooked up. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and click Mythic there. You saw it change to Mythic. Click Heroic. I wonder why these aren't, it's not really updating this screen very well. Okay. So these 2 aren't hooked up yet, but notice when I clicked Mythic, it set the label to Mythic, but I didn't hard code Mythic. It set the label to whatever the button that called this guy has on it, which means now I could use this one IB action for multiple buttons. I can hook all 3 of my buttons up to this one guy because he knows, he becomes aware of who called him. Does that make sense? You could do the same thing in Android. That's why Android has that view V that gets passed in right here. Because you could have one function that is set for multiple different things on click.
We can differentiate using the ID, right?
Well, I mean, I suppose you could, but you can say, are you a button, or you can say, what is your ID? Yeah, you could ask, is which button this is. I happen to know that this guy's only hooked up to buttons. So if just quickly I go back out here, let me reset the constraints on this guy, see if he'll actually stick this time. All right, so what I'll do is, here's my mythic button pressed. I'll drag this onto heroic, and these are all the different events that can occur there. So instead of just being on click, I can say that whenever you touch down on it, or whenever you touch up but you're still on the inside of the button, or you touch up outside of the button, or value change. There's a bunch of events, but touch up inside is usually the one you're looking for. That's like clicked. Yeah. The alternative is touch down. So the two competing thoughts are, when you click a button, do you want the event to register when you first hit, or when you hit and let go? Because sometimes you'll hit a button and you'll say, oh, I changed my mind. You'll drag your finger off of it and then let go, and then it won't happen. So if you just do touch down, it happens. As soon as you hit it, it happened. If you do touch up inside, it'll only happen when you let go of it while still on it, as opposed to hitting it, moving your finger, and then letting go. Now you're touching up outside. Make sense? So touch up inside is usually the go-to move for the most accurate click event. All right. So now I hooked all three of these buttons up to that single event guy there. And let me go ahead and stretch this across the screen just so we can see it. All right. And I'm going to click here. I'm going to say update constraint constants. So that's one kind of bad thing with iOS, is you constantly need to be managing your constraints for your interface. Now the benefit to it is you can now make your interface look right on all those different screen sizes. The downside is you kind of have to micromanage these constraints. You can usually let Apple do it for you. What I just did is I just came in here and I said update constraints. So I clicked on that. Well, actually, I probably need to click here, then click here, then click here, and hopefully updated the constraints. Okay. So let's go ahead and hit play on this. So now all three of those buttons talk to the exact same IB action. No, still screwed up. Actually, it's still very screwed up. It's funny. It's the right device there. Let's just reset the suggested constraints. It's very weird.
No, we have setting to 50%.
It doesn't matter. That it still should scale. Yeah. It's got to be just because I have those, just for the sake of argument here. Just so we don't have to screw around with too many of these things. We can always fix the interface later. I'm just going to run it on the 7 Plus. Because really the problem is, because I have 3 buttons and I've spaced them away from each other, it's trying to guess what I mean about that spacing. So it's trying to maintain the distance between normal and heroic, as well as heroic and mythic. And when you start running out of screen real estate, it can't figure out where to put the stuff. But this will look fine now. And then I'll just shrink this guy down. We'll scale this to, let's see, what does 50% look like? 50% still scrolls. Let's do 33%. Ha! Perfect. All right, so there's our 33%. So if I click normal, it says normal. If I click heroic, it says heroic. If I click mythic, it says mythic. Make sense? Okay. Now, realistically, we could have that one IB action handle all those, or we can hook up the individual IB actions. I typically prefer to have separate IB actions for each button unless you're doing literally the same logic for every single one. Okay, so if you're doing the same thing for 5 different buttons, literally the same thing, then yes, use one IB action, hook all 5 buttons up to it. But if you're doing something a little bit different for each of those buttons, I think it makes more sense to have your logic compartmentalized so that you can say, oh, well, what happens when I click the normal button? Oh, the normal button shows this stuff. What happens when I click the heroic button? You know, so on and so forth. That make sense? All right. So let's go in here. Click on this far right guy that shows my outlets. I'm going to go ahead and just disconnect all these dudes. So I'll click heroic button press to the heroic guy, touch up inside. I'm going to set normal button pressed, touch up inside. And then I'll reconnect mythic button pressed, touch up inside. We'll go ahead and run this. And now it's going to have the same visible output to us, but only the mythic one is showing whatever's on the button that was sent. The other 2 are putting in normal or heroic, hard-coded. Make sense? So far, even though we're looking at this the Swift way and the iOS way, we haven't done anything that we haven't already done on Android, right? We're clicking on buttons and changing what's on a label. It's kind of our bread and butter. You know, how things, you know, we're building all of our interfaces in terms of that crap. Make sense?
We still have to look at Morelos.
Huh?
We still have to reach Morelos.
Yep. All right. So there's normal, there's heroic, and there's mythic, with the exception that mythic was pulling the word mythic off the button, whereas heroic and normal were pulling it, just hard coding in normal. Okay? Now, what we want to happen here is we want this guy down here to be a list of elements. Now, let's see. Have you guys done a list view in the Android stuff, or you've just done the add the text things? You had a vertical you had a vertical layout that you added things to, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to do something kind of similar to that, but it's actually pretty difficult to do that on iOS. So I'm actually going to do a table view thing on here, so you'll kind of see how that works. The equivalent of this does exist on Android. They're called list views, but you can accomplish it using the same thing you've already been doing, using just dropping the labels in there. Okay. All right. So now what I want to happen is when I click on normal, heroic, or mythic, I want this guy down here to show me a list of stuff. That makes sense? All right. And that list that's going to be in here is going to be a list of dungeons. Okay. Now, the way I'm going to accomplish this is, and let me actually do it in 2 pieces first. I'm just going to throw a button out here just for the time being. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to throw a special kind of activity. All right, so this is a activity that inherently knows how to show a list. Okay, if this was the equivalent on Android, what we've done on Android up to this point is we only have used normal activities. And if we want an activity to have a list in it, what we do is we take a vertical linear layout and we add labels to it, right? Okay, I'm effectively going to do the same thing here, but I'm going to be using a specialty activity for showing lists. Okay, because doing what is easy to do on Android is not so easy on here. To just add things and have them automatically stack on top of each other, it's much more complex on iOS. All right, but you'll see that this actually isn't bad, what we're about to do here. So this is my interface, so now I need to create my code behind for this guy. So I'm going to come up here, I'm going to right click, I'm going to say new file. And this guy's going to be an iOS file. He's going to be a Cocoa Touch class. So this is no different than saying new activity. All right. I'm going to hit next. And he's going to be not a UI view controller, but he's going to be a UI table view controller. So imagine that there exists a table activity or a list activity, a specialty activity that knows inherently how to deal with lists easily. Okay, even though we've been doing it a different way. All right, so I'll come in here and I'm going to go ahead and name this guy Dungeon List. Okay, so that guy's going to be Dungeon List and his type is UI Table View Controller. So I'll hit next. This adds it to the project. So there it is. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just copy the name of that real quick. We'll go into my storyboard. We'll go over here to this new guy I had dropped on there. And this is the identity inspector right here. And this guy, by default, is of type generic UI table view controller. I don't want him to be a generic UI table view controller. I want him to be a Dungeon List, which is a UI table view controller. MVC. What I just did there is MVC. The equivalent to this in Android is if you look at like on main activity inside of onCreate, it sets its content view equal to r.layout.main activity.xml or whatever. That's when it does the same thing I just did here. Make sense? It's just MVC. How does this screen know about its code behind? I linked the two right there. Okay? So this guy's going to be a Dungeon List. Now, the way I'm going to get to this screen right now is from this button. So I'm just going to control click there and say show. So now that screen will get me there. That's not how we're going to ultimately do it, but that's what I'm just doing for right now, just so we can test this. Okay? So I'm going to go into our Dungeon List code here. And this guy inherently has stuff built into it for showing lists of things. Okay? It knows how to show a number of sections. It knows how to show a number of rows for a section. So we're going to say that our list has one section in it. And for right now, let's just say that that section has 25 rows, just so we can see the scrolling. Okay? Because what have we done? We've put a vertical linear layout inside of a scroll view so that it scrolls, right? Okay, this automatically does that for you. All right, so I'm going to say it has 25 rows. Okay, now this code right here that they've embedded for us, but it's commented out. This is how we define a cell for one of those rows. This is how we define a row. So I'm just going to say cell.textLabel.text is equal to so this is going to say row 0, row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4. So we have this thing that gets called here called an index path. It's a variable that's being passed in here. So this is a function called cell for a row at index path that ultimately returns a table view cell. And what we do, oh, actually, I need to do something here. I'm going to call my identifier here, I'm going to call it cell. So we're going to see a little bit more MVC here in a second. So I named my reuse identifier here cell. Now I'm going to go back out to my main storyboard. I'm going to click on that cell. And here's the reuse identifier. I'll put cell in there. We just link those two. That's MVC again. All right. So I've let the code, well, I've let the interface know how I'm going to be referring to each cell in the code. All right, so we'll go back here to our dungeon list. So what this does right here is it gives us a cell whose reuse identifier is cell for the given index path. And an index path is a unique address for a given section and a given row in that section. For us right now, we only have one section, so all index paths will be for section 0, but it'll be for row 0, row 1, row 2, row 3. And this is for performance reasons. And Android does the same thing if you were to use their list view. So this is a reusable cell. So if you imagine on a screen, let's say 10 rows fit on the screen. It might at any point in time create 12 rows. And as you're scrolling through, it'll reuse rows that had already previously used and just change their content. So your memory footprint doesn't get huge. Otherwise, if you had 10 million rows, your application will be huge in terms of a memory footprint because each of those 10 million rows would be an instance of a UI table view cell. Instead of there only ever being 12 UI table view cells that you just keep reusing as the person's scrolling through 10 million rows. Does that make sense? Yeah. As soon as this guy goes off the screen, we don't care about him anymore, so we can reuse him down here. Make sense? So it's just a speed thing. And Android does the same thing if you use their list views. So this grabs me a cell. Okay, so it either builds a new cell if it was the first time, or it dequeues the existing cell if it had already been pre-built. And then I'm just going to go ahead and throw a string on there. So this guy right here, row, this is concatenation, string concatenation in Swift. So I'm saying put the word row followed by a space and then replace this guy, / open close parentheses, allows me to put a variable in there. So what I have highlighted there will boil down to the value that is index path that row. So this will be 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, so on and so forth. And then ultimately this will return the cell. Now, this is for our list activity. Okay? So that screen that we have on the interface knows he's a specialty activity. He knows he's a list view. This guy knows how to populate list views. So what automatically happens behind the scenes is when that page launches, it says, how many sections am I supposed to have? How many rows are in that are in each of those sections? So it'll call this one time for each of these sections. And then it'll call this one time for each cell in each row in each section to get the content. It will do all this automatically. We don't have to do anything else. So effectively, we have the specialty activity that knows how to show a list, and then we just had to set up the couple of things in here to show the list. Okay? So we're going to go ahead and run this guy. And we'll click on our button that we hooked up to take us to that second page. And what we should see is 25 rows. Let's say row 0, or row 1, row 2, and it should be big enough to scroll off the screen. Okay, so there's all our rows. So there's our 0 to 24. Make sense? Okay. And you could pull off the exact same thing in Android if you do here. Android list view. And it uses things called array adapters. So notice you have this thing called a list activity. All right. And inside of list activities, you set the adapter for the list. The adapter is going to be an array that knows how to, it's more difficult to work with in Android. So it's more difficult to do the other way that you guys have already done in iOS. It's more difficult to do this in Android. It's not bad, but it's more cryptic. You know, you got to do a lot more moving parts. But effectively, it pretty much works the same way. All right. On list item click, So we're going to have a thing where we can respond to a click on an item in the list. Same thing exists in Android. So what we're doing here, there's a model for that in Android called a list view. Okay. All right. So there is our row. Now, what we want to happen here is we want there to be three, well, we really need to have three separate lists, right? We need to have a list of normal dungeons, we need to have a list of heroic dungeons, and we need to have a list of mythic dungeons. So this guy right here, the single list view, needs to be able to show three different kinds of lists depending on what I tell him to show. If I tell him to show the normal dungeons, he should show the normal dungeons. If I tell him to show the heroic dungeons, he should show the heroic dungeons, so on and so forth. Okay. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to have three different collections, three different arrays filled with dungeon names. We're going to hard code them right now because after we take a break, we'll end up actually hooking in the database to this. But let's just get the prototype working that is filled up with fake data. And then we can take a break, okay? So what I'm going to do up here inside of my dungeon list is I'm going to create three arrays. Okay? Three arrays of, for right now, there'll be strings, arrays of strings. One of them is going to be the names of my normal dungeons, heroic dungeons, mythic dungeons. Okay? So I'm going to say we're going to have a var normal dungeons, and this guy is going to be a string array. Var heroic dungeons is going to be a string array. And var mythic dungeons is going to be a string array. Make sense? And syntax is a little bit different, but it's similar enough, right? I mean, this is equivalent in Java to say string array mythic dungeons is equal to a new string array. Let's put a question mark there right now because actually we would have to give it a number in there. So actually the Java way of doing this would be, the equivalent in Java would be this. Linked list of string mythic dungeons is equal to a new linked list of string. So these two lines effectively do the same thing. Bottom ones in Java, top ones in Swift. That make sense? But it's just syntax, right? Just like if you walk into a place and ask for a cheeseburger in your language, it's going to sound different than me asking for a cheeseburger in English. We're still both asking for cheeseburgers, right? Right? You're asking for what you want. You know, he orders a pizza. You know, so what's your native language? Hindi? Hindi. Oh, see, he was surprised. I knew what his native language is. Do you have a sub-language, Urdu or Telugu? Urdu? Urdu? What? Telugu? Telugu? I only speak Urdu, so I don't speak Telugu. Just Urdu. So you do speak Urdu? Kind of, yeah. So he can't talk to us.
Urdu and Hindi is actually the same when you speak it. There is like
Nah, Hindi's way easier. I know Hindi. Everybody knows Hindi.
Script is different.
But script is it is written differently, but it is spoken
Urdu
like
script
same.
is similar to Arabic, whereas Hindi is totally different.
Okay. So the written version of them is different, but the spoken version of them is similar.
And because of words, available in Urdu and Hindi.
Differently.
So who stole from who? Did Urdu steal from Hindi? Or did?
Urdu steal from Hindi.
Oh, man.
The mother language of all these languages is Sanskrit.
Okay.
From Sanskrit,
Gotcha.
Hindi is
Sanskrit
inherited,
is,
and from Hindi, Urdu has come.
I don't know how people were like Indian people right now they're like a lot more articles and things like this. Sanskrit is the best language for coding.
So so why don't you just speak Sanskrit?
I don't know. I don't know that language.
Maybe we got to start a trend. Maybe we should just all drop down to Sanskrit. Just go back,
Yeah,
go old school, right?
They're saying the Sanskrit is the best way to like coding is super easy with that.
Sanskrit is like generic and it's very difficult.
There's only one village in India which is in Maharashtra somewhere, which speaks Sanskrit now. They are the only people.
So that's where the smart people are.
Yeah, they are the only people left. Yeah,
So we would say out
they
there.
are so villages. Yeah, that is like outdated.
So you guys surprised I know so much about your languages?
We have
Telugu, Urdu,
300
Hindi.
plus-
I know all of them. Well, most of them.
300 plus. What is
I
it?
speak 200 of them fluently.
You say dialects? We have 600 plus, 1600 plus dialects.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in the United States we have like 4. You got Texas. Okay, that's a dialect in and of itself. Then you got the Midwest dialect. You know, we have the accent. And then you almost have a southern. We're like a half southern accent. Once you start getting down towards Texas, people get more southern. Okay, then you got the Boston accent. That's a little different. The New Yorker is kind of like a Boston mixed with Texas. Same thing. All right. But the point here is that even though these things look different, we're accomplishing the same stuff. Okay. So we'll have 3 different arrays here. And inside of viewDidLoad here, so this is kind of like on create in our Android thing, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to fill those 3 arrays up with some dummy information. All right. We'll eventually be pulling it from the database. Okay, but right now I'll fill it up with dummy information. So let's go ahead and let's say there's 10 normal dungeons, there's 20 heroic dungeons, and there's 30 mythic dungeons. All right. So I'm going to say for, let's see. It doesn't like that. So 3 dots, maybe it's 3 dots. You happy with that? All right. So here's our 20. Here's our 30. This guy will be heroic. This guy will be mythic. This guy will be heroic. This guy will be mythic. Okay, so I filled up my arrays. Now what I'll do here is I'm going to go ahead and down here where we just have it hard-coded 25, we're going to pick one of our arrays to be the source array. So let's start with normal. So I'll say self.normalDungeons.count. How many rows do we have? The same number of rows as we have normal dungeons. Make sense? So then what are we going to do down here? We're going to say self.normalDungeons at bucket indexPath.row. Give me the string that lives at that position in the array. All right. So we'll go ahead and run this, and now we'll see that we should have 10. You know, normal 0, normal 1, normal 2. Okay, there's my guys. Now, what we really want, though, is we want to be able to hit the button on the first one and have it show the different dungeons, have it be able to toggle this, right? So we need to teach our dungeon list how to show the different dungeons. Make sense? And how to toggle. So we're going to go ahead and inside of dungeon list, I'm going to have a var cur list is going to be a, actually let's do this. We're going to have it start off as normal dungeons, like that. All right, so we'll have it. Oh, what is it not like about that? Oh, okay, that's fine. Cur list is going to be a string array. This says, "Trust me, I will set it to be a string array shortly." The little exclamation point is something called an optional. I'm saying, "Trust me, I'll give it a value." All right, so this guy's going to be like this. Yeah, hold on. Value's coming shortly. So then what I'll do down here is I'll set self.curlist equal to self.normal dungeons. So we'll default the thing to normal dungeons. Okay? So now what I'll do is down here, instead of saying normal dungeons.count, I'll say self.curlist.count, which happens to be normal dungeons right now, but that guy will point to whatever I toggle it to point to. I haven't put in the logic yet to toggle it, but now whatever cur list points to, that's the list I'm dealing with, whether it's normal or heroic or mythic. All right, so I'm writing these parts more generically. Similarly, this is going to be cur list. Make sense? So I'm writing all these guys generically now. Okay, so let's run it again. We should see the exact same output we had before, but we know we're actually getting to it through a pointer rather than hard coding in the normal dungeons array. Make sense? All right, so there's my same list, but if I just decided to change this one line to heroic dungeons, now it's going to be 20 heroic dungeons. That make sense? So now I've made it easier to toggle. All right. So there's my 20 heroic dungeons. If I change this to mythic, I'll have 30 mythics. Okay, so we'll have it default to normal just because that maybe makes some sense. Really, actually, probably mythic makes the most sense because I'm thinking about it from using the tool. Anybody who's going to be interested in this tool only cares about mythics. The fact that we have normals and heroics is just kind of a it's just fluff. Yeah. If you're and the reason for that is because if you're going after a specific heroic for gear, you're not doing it very efficiently. Because you can actually run the heroics as many times as you want every week, as long as you participate in something called the Dungeon Finder. And if you queue for the Dungeon Finder for a random heroic, you can run the same dungeon 200 times in a week. As long as it randomly puts you in that dungeon, not you choosing the dungeon. So most people run heroics just because they want to farm something called artifact power. It's something different. If you're farming a heroic for gear, you're pathetic. It's like me running long distances. It's the same thing. All right, so let's take this one step farther so we can take a little break. All right, so we'll start with normal dungeons that are default. So now we need to be able to externally tell our list which it should show. Okay, now, am I the list for normal, or am I the list for heroic, or am I the list for mythic? That make sense? All right, so we're going to have this guy have a toggle event. Okay. Now there's a couple of ways we could do this actually. I'm going to show you the better way of doing this. All right, it's a little bit more advanced than than you're probably going to end up doing on the Android side, but you can get an equivalent-ish type solution. All right, but I'll show you kind of the cooler way of doing it. At some point, I mentioned something in Android about something called fragments. Did you guys, or you maybe read about fragments? A fragment is something I usually avoid in Android because it's kind of a complex topic. But imagine an activity embedded inside of another activity. All right, sometimes that's handy. In this case, that's kind of what we want. We'd like us to be, I'm on the wrong screen there, but we'd like for us to be able to hit those buttons and just see the list change on the bottom. You know, I hit normal, now it's normal. If I hit heroic, now it's heroic. If I hit not, go to another screen. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I'll show you how you can accomplish that in this. You don't have to do it in yours. You can just, the equivalent logic, you know, make sure you can show the different lists. All right. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get rid of this button. This button no longer takes us there. Okay? I want this guy to actually be the bottom part of this screen. Make sense? All right. So I have something in here called a container. All right. Now, this guy is, think of this like fragments in Android. So if you want to try to understand how fragments in Android basically work, that's what I'm showing you here. I'm not encouraging you to use fragments, but this is how they work. So I click on, hold on, I selected the right thing. So that guy came with his own little view controller. I'm going to kill that. I'm going to get rid of that because we don't actually want that one. Instead, we're going to drag it over to this guy, and we're going to choose embed. So we're embedding that guy in this guy. Okay, so he's this little tiny thing. So I'll just run it real quick so you can see how this works, right? Because it's not going to be very big on the screen. So there's our normals. Okay, but now I can, I can stretch this guy out a little bit. So we'll take it there. We'll drag him over here. Drag this down here. All right, and now it'll be bigger. Okay, here, I'll run it real quick just so you can see it. Now, one issue we have here, though, is I need to get programmatic access to that list, that dungeon list, so that I can tell it when one of my buttons was pressed and say, hey, you need to show the heroic dungeons now, or hey, you need to show the mythic dungeons now. Make sense? Okay. I need to be able to talk to that guy. Because right now, when I hit heroic, oh, it's going to crash because I got rid of my label. But remember those guys are trying to adjust the label that doesn't exist anymore? Bad news bears. All right, so that's why it crashed. So when I click on one of those guys, I want it to tell my list to update himself to show normals or heroics or mythics. Make sense? So in order to do that, I need to have access to that guy. Now, this is where things get a little bit interesting. And also, this is where you get to see a bug in Apple's stuff. Let me go over here to Dungeon List. All the way down here at the bottom, there's a commented out thing here called, it's for a storyboard segue. Okay. This dude right here. I'm going to go ahead and copy that. What happens is, because we are embedding our thing inside of an activity inside of an activity, a view controller inside of a view controller, this segue will get called. Because we're not actually, in Android, when you create an intent, and then tell the activity to launch that intent, that's when that view controller, that's when the activity is actually born. For us, our activity, our list activity, is actually automatically born for us. When that main screen shows up and it says, oh, I'm supposed to have one of those dudes embedded in here, he's automatically born. If we need to have access to that variable, so that we can toggle it, we need to catch it. Okay, and we do that with this prepare for segue. So I'm going to copy that code because this is kind of a bug in Apple's starter code here. It didn't come with a commented out version of that code down here. There's no good reason for it, but you know how it was commented out on the other screen? That should have just had the same little chunk of starter code down here for me to uncomment, but it didn't. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give myself a variable up top. We're going to call this var dungeon list, and this guy's going to be a dungeon list. So this is another promise. I'll give you that variable. Down here, I'll say self.dungeon list is equal to segue.destination as dungeon list. Now let me just go ahead and click. I'm going to put a breakpoint here real quick so you'll see when this breaks. So I'm going to launch the application, and as that main screen is launching, before we see it, it's going to handle its embedded view, its embedded activity. And that's when it's going to call this. It's going to say, hey, I've created your dungeon list activity. If you want to do anything with it, this is your chance to grab it. It's the destination of that segue. Now, right now, I only have one segue. Only one thing is actually happening, so I don't need to determine, is this the embedded segue for that guy, or is it this other segue, or is it this other segue? Since I only have one thing actually occurring, I don't have to put an if statement here to find out if this is the actual dungeon list or if this is something else. Because you could have a whole bunch of segues. So if I have another button that I have drug over to another screen, that's a second segue. That means this guy would get called twice. And then I might be making a very poor assumption here to assume that this destination controller is actually a dungeon list. It might be the other page dungeon, other page view controller that the other thing goes to. So when I run this, you'll see that the app won't even finish launching when this guy gets called, because it's not on the screen yet, because it's having to create our dungeon list. See, it stops right there. So at this point here, it's going to go to our segue, which is the behind this. It's the way that Apple automates these two screens talking to each other without us writing code. Okay, so when we do that automated thing, we just drag from one screen to another. That creates a segue. All right, so through automation means that we need to have this ability in order to kind of handle stuff. All right, so I'm saying segue, give me your destination. And I happen to know that he's a dungeon list. So I'll go ahead and convert him into a dungeon list. I'll set him equal to my dungeon list variable, which I promised I would give you up here. Make sense? So I'll go ahead and let that thing finish launching. So we have that on here. All right. Now, we're not using that variable yet, but now this main screen here, main activity, has programmatic access to this embedded activity, our dungeon list. So I could tell this guy now, if I wrote the code, how to toggle himself. All right, so what we're going to do here, I'm going to go over to our dungeon list, and I'm just going to write a couple of quick functions. This might not necessarily be the best way of doing it, but it's probably the fastest way of doing it. So I'm going to say func show normal dungeons. Copy this. Show heroic. Show mythic. For show normal dungeons, we're going to say self.curlist is equal to self.normal dungeons. And then self.tableview.reload data. So whenever I call this function, show normal dungeons, I make my cur list point to the normal dungeons list, and then I tell my table view to reload himself. And what does the table view do when he reloads himself? He says, how many rows do I have? What's my data for all the rows? He calls all that stuff again. All right. So now I have 3 different messages I can yell at my dungeon list. I can say, hey, show normal. Hey, show heroic. Hey, show mythic. Make sense? So now all I have to do is I need to yell that at him from the other screen. And we have access to him over there. So all I have to do is in here, instead of hooking up buttons and crap, if I say mythic, I'm going to say self.dungeonlist.show mythic dungeons. Self.dungeonlist.show heroic dungeons. Self.dungeonlist.show mythic dungeons. Make sense? So I captured that dungeon list down here while he was being embedded. Now I can talk to him whenever I want from within inside main activity. I then taught dungeon list how to toggle between his different dungeon lists, right? And then depending on which button I press, I tell that guy to show the right kind of dungeon. Go ahead and launch this. So normal's the one by default. Oh, hold on. Why is normal going to mythic? Show normal dungeons. Sets up normal dungeons. Okay. And in here, normal dungeons. Oh, I have it saying show mythic dungeons. That's why. When I did the autocomplete, it must have been on mythic instead of normal. I was calling the wrong function. It did exactly what I told it to do. I just told it to do the wrong thing. So normal's always normal now. There's heroic, there's mythic, there's normal. Make sense? Okay. So let's take somewhat short. Can we do like maybe a 12-minute break? Just come back 10 after? That good? That way we can get enough more done? Plenty done? Okay. 12 minutes. Go. Be back at 8:10.